Well, Liesel, I would like to welcome you to the Sharpen podcast. It is so fun to have you on for multiple reasons. I'm getting to see your face today. The last time we spoke, we connected by phone, so it's always a great joy to see you folks. I was almost going to say in person, but it's not in person, but you get what I'm saying. And also to welcome a fellow podcaster. So, first of all, welcome to the Sharpen podcast.
Thank you. And it's nice to see your face as well on this morning, Kirby.
Yeah. Well, we connected before the call even began about stepping over kids' toys and art sets and everything else to even get to where we are right now. So we feel really accomplished just being here.
Right. It's the last week of school for my preschoolers, so I'm enjoying the quiet Monday morning before summer unfurls in my household.
Yes, and the art kits and the
That's
slime.
right.
And some suits, yeah. Well, hey, folks are meeting you for the first time today. So tell us about who you are.
My name is Liesel, as you noted. Telling you about who I am. Well, I am the mother of 5 children, 4 of which are living. They range in ages from 11, my eldest, all the way down to age 4. So it's a busy household, and when things are good, they're really good, and when they're chaotic, they are really chaotic. I love to paddleboard. I love to hike and be outdoors with the family. I am an avid reader of the news and The Economist each week, and I am also a workplace empathy consultant, which is some of what we'll talk about today, but that's been shaped. When you ask me who I am, I mentioned the daughter we have that is not living. That is a daughter named Mercy Joan. She would have been 8 this year. And so her death has powerfully shaped both who I am and the work that I do, as well as our youngest, the almost 5-year-old, his birthday's in June, Moses. He's also had some substantial heart needs and needs for medical intervention. And that's powerfully shaped what I do. I live in central Indiana, which is where I grew up. It was not necessarily where I thought I'd come back to. The world was really large. I was excited about traveling. My husband and I lived in Kenya after he finished grad work for a year. And sometimes I still am surprised to be like, I'm in a town where I see people that I went to high school with. That's crazy. But it's good to be back near family. And I reconcile myself to the soybean fields and the corn, even though what I really want are the rolling hills that I think characterize a little bit more of the landscape of where you're from.
We'd love to have you in Kentucky. So just come on down.
We do like Kentucky. We've driven through a couple of times and even camped once or twice, but we like it down there.
Yeah. Well, you're from a beautiful area as well. But we still, as Kentuckians, we're constantly recruiting folks to move to the state.
Come on down.
Come on down.
It's unfortunately flat here.
Yeah.
But oh well.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned earlier about the work that you do, and it's so much ingrained of your own story, a workplace empathy consultant. So tell us a little bit more about that, what that looks like, and even where that stems from, because there's a story to that as well.
There is a story. So I'll go back to when I was in my first semester of an MBA program down at the Kelley School at IU. I'd said yes to the Kelley School, and I found out a week later that I was unexpectedly pregnant with our 3rd child, this little girl, Mercy Joan. And we found out at the 20-week scan that she had a birth defect where the base of her skull had not closed all the way. So she had this large fluid-filled sac on the back of her skull. And the doctors didn't know in utero if this would be something that would be operable, if it would be terminal. And they said to us, you're going to have to wait until we can get an outside the womb MRI to really know. And so we waited. It was 2nd semester of my first year of business school when I gave birth to Mercy Joan on February 15th. And it was really clear that doing anything would be doing things to her and not for her. She couldn't breathe on her own. And so she lived for 8 days before she died. And that's that's a marking tragedy. It's horrible.
Mhm.
I mean,
Mhm.
it's even to going back to school, like everybody had known I was so visibly 9 months pregnant. And some people knew it was a complicated um, pregnancy. Some people didn't. And just stepping back into the world of class and small talk, um, was really hard as people were like, hey, you had your baby. And then having to
Oh
say,
gosh.
yeah, but she died. And then having to actually manage their emotions as they were struggling to
Mm.
find what to say. But that was my first window into the people who really like intuitively knew how to be supportive and meaningful gestures. I think of Gail Nichols, who she's actually a guest that I interviewed on the podcast, is going to be a coming episode,
Mhm.
because she was shaped by her own story of loss, but she was the director of student services, and I remember her showing up in my hospital room. And
Mm.
she had this handwritten letter from the dean. She had a gift that she'd brought. She was the point person to talk to all my professors so they could be in the loop when I returned. And on the one hand, like, that did not fix the fact that my daughter had died. It was still totalizing and terrible, but it really helped in being like, when I go back, like, I feel like this place is a place that can receive me, that I can have a soft landing within. Um, so I incorporated that story as the years went on when you've had something like that happen. And then with my son, who has a totally unrelated but still really serious heart condition where
Mhm.
he's needed a couple of open heart surgeries, you start stepping into this world of all of these people's stories of their loss and like how people dealt with it. And I began to like start pulling at the pieces of what are our existing support systems? How are we doing this well or poorly? Specifically in the workplace where we spend like more waking hours than we do at home.
Yeah.
And I found that it was really scattershot for all the things that we measure in the world of business to see about like their efficacy and their impact. Um, Especially in a time where companies are really fighting to attract good workers and retain them. I realized it really depends on the personality of a given individual. Managers and coworkers oftentimes feel totally overwhelmed and under-equipped, and like, what do I say to that person who's going through a divorce? What do I do for somebody who their father just died? And people default to either like silence or
Mhm.
just tossing out the same tired cliches that somebody gave them a decade ago, and saying, neither of that is really getting at the goal of helping people survive, stabilize, and then thrive in the aftermath of adversity. So through some consulting workshops, the coming podcast, and a software-based tool that we are raising capital for and building out in the next 9 months or so, that is what I'm seeking to address in the American workplace.
Mm. Well, such important, needed work, and I'm so thankful. First of all, thank you for sharing with us of Mercy today and telling us about her. Um, I just so appreciate you you sharing um, about her story and your story as well. And I think about too what you're talking about in the workplace are just those really hard life circumstances, and when we forget that that doesn't exist, when we view employees, coworkers, but go beyond. We always say our tagline for Sharpen is the workplace and beyond, neighbors, brothers, sisters, parents, etc. When we just treat it like you said, with the same old things we've heard said before, or we go super quiet, which actually I think that's the one I would probably witness, is that it just becomes this, I don't know what to say, and therefore I'm just gonna, I'll just wait, I'll let them have time and space, and then it never really gets addressed. But can you just start, I think, a helpful piece of today. So when you're meeting with clients, teams, et cetera, for the first time, how do you address this conversation? How do you go about bringing this up in a room? Do you define empathy? And I'm kind of going in a couple of directions here, Liesel. But one thing I hear from whether it's hiring groups or the HR person is that just a needed emphasis on empathy in employees. And really, sometimes it's from a customer perspective or a problem solving perspective, because if you don't have empathy, you really can't think what it's like in your customer's shoes. But it sounds like to me there's a whole other piece that you're saying is like your teammates, your employees, your et cetera. So I guess all of that to say, how do you go about this conversation in those initial stages? Do you define empathy? And also, can you speak to that kind of empathy deficit that we're seeing, or that we're told that we're seeing from a recruitment hiring perspective?
Right. Well, I see a couple of interesting parts to your reflection. The first is I'm going to address convincing people of the need and some of the seismic shifts that are occurring just in the broader labor market and how they are translating. One aspect of that, when you talk about people realizing is there a need here or not, there are two movements going on. One, we have the baby boomers who are still in the workplace, but they're aging and their parents are aging as well. And I think especially when my parents were entering the workplace, and definitely my grandparents, there was a lot more of this sense of, you came to work and you executed, and your home life and your personal life, that was totally separate than what you did at work. And the two should not overlap. And that was the expectation. And especially as the workforce was dominated so much more by men, that was the reality that was expressed in a certain culture of what the worker was supposed to do. I think that's shifting. People oftentimes talk about a millennial workforce, and they'll kind of like say it with an eye roll, like, oh, millennials in the workforce. I think it's a really beautiful thing that a younger workforce is bringing, in that what they're articulating, when you look at either quantitative data or just qualitative, what people are saying they want in their work experience, is tied a lot more to a bigger purpose and having it be able to integrate with the rest of their life and their other pursuits and the meaning that they want there. And what that means also is, in difficult times, what they're looking for is not to have that be totally severed from their work experience. Like, okay, I've just got to compartmentalize this horrible relational breakup that is going on, and just suck it up and go to work. Because that was never quite reality anyway. I would say that disruptive life events, which is the broad category that I talk about, broader than just grief or death. It's returning to work postpartum. It is a diagnosis. It is perhaps relocating and moving from somewhere across the country. They're already affecting your workplace. The question is, are you always playing catch up, or are you, in terms of, employees that are distracted, they're spending 20% of their time maybe scrolling through WebMD because they're so stressed out about this thing that they don't know what's going to happen. All the way to somebody who's so detached that they quit, they're mishandled, and you have to pay for retraining and recruitment. So they're already affecting the workplace. Some employers, so you asked about, like, in a session, how do I bring this topic to the fore? Some employers are already realizing this sort of movement. They're investing in things like wellness programs. They're wanting to touch on some of these metrics of employee engagement. And, but they're still like putting people in the mental and emotional space of, okay, what does this actually look like? Because if you have been that manager who has had somebody come to you just distraught and say, my son was just in a car accident and I've got to go now. And you're dealing with it in that moment, but you're also thinking, okay, what are our policies about how much time off they get, or HR, or, wow, if somebody's dealing with their spouse's diagnosis of an incredibly aggressive brain tumor, how much time, how do I need to scale them back up in their work? How do I have that conversation? Like, if you've lived through that complication, you go, oh yeah, I get it. I would have wanted some guidance in that. I hear that all the time. Like, somebody who's actually experienced that, they would have wanted those tools. So what I try to do, one of the first exercises that we do is I have people pair off, and I've made just index cards with statements on them. Anything from, um, he walked out last night and we're getting a divorce, or my son just got diagnosed with leukemia, or the cancer is back. And I have people, so they don't know what card the other person's holding, and I have them just role play. Okay, one person says to the other, the cancer's back, and you're suddenly on the spot. And I have them respond. What do they say? What do they find themselves promising? What do they find themselves not knowing? And then as the session progresses, we begin getting into some of that minutia. Okay, like, where did you go to when the person said that? Would you say that again? When you launched into that story about how your dad had cancer once, that actually was distracting from that person's need in the moment and putting the spotlight back on you. Is that really what you wanted to do? What's a better thing to say? What's a better way to go about that? So what you say in those moments is just one small part of empathy at work, but it's an initial touch point. And that's usually the place that we begin, just to be building awareness to some of those issues.
Gosh, that activity sounds so good, so helpful to walk through that, because those are those one-liners that you're not expecting an employee. You expect them to say, "Hey, I'm running late on my expense report. What do you think about it?"
Right.
Not
and
the
we've been
other.
early for lunch. Yeah.
Correct. And I can imagine that just the role play aspect, it makes you to be intentional about when the situations arise. You mentioned earlier when you were in business school how some folks responded in a way that really allowed you to walk through your grief and to transition back to school at the same time. It didn't ignore the fact that you had gone through this very tragic experience. It also allowed you to enter back into school, the workplace, fill in the blank. I can imagine that several listeners right now can either relate to that, or they will one day, right? That is life. What were some of those? And I can imagine even from the activity you just described, what are some of those really helpful things to say or not to say, or to do or not to do? And I don't want to formulate answers, right? Because we're human and we know each other to different extents. But I'm sure that you've had many of those conversations with employers and employees.
Yeah, I want to answer that by framing it first with a metaphor that has been helpful for me.
Mm-hmm.
Because I think that when you start talking about empathy at work, there can be this initial connection. Oh, yes, I want to do that.
Mm-hmm.
But then when you start pondering like the limitations of your own experience and the breadth of need, somebody can start thinking like, oh my gosh, I don't even know where to start. How can I possibly have a skill set that is helpful for a miscarriage, to move? It feels overwhelming really fast.
Mm-hmm.
And with the caveat that we want to equip people, like, what your role in the workplace as a manager or a coworker, or even a friend is not to offer like fully fledged counseling. It's to offer care and just a sense of like stability. So the metaphor that's helpful to me is, in the world of the physical, we've actually figured this out because we have this category of people called first responders. And what a first responder is it's somebody who has been trained in this basic tools of assessment and administering care. And they haven't had to go to medical school and residency. They're not a doctor. They're not an ambulance driver. What they are is someone who has this basic skill set that is helpful and applicable, whether somebody's been hit by a baseball bat or hit by a car. And what we're wanting to do is take that sort of framing and translate it to the emotional, social realm. What is like a basic toolkit of care that includes some assessment and some stabilization that can be helpful across the board?
That's good.
So in training people, to get back to your question, what are some basic things that you can do in that initial assessment? A big part of assessment is just being able to listen to the information that that person is willing to provide in real time. So, because a given individual can even be complicated. Like in the morning, somebody could want to talk about it. By the afternoon, maybe they don't want to say anything at all. And how can you allow yourself as the manager or coworker the space to be able to respond well to either of those situations and be able to read them well. One part of that is just being able to listen, and you can listen well by saying observational statements of sympathy and concern. So, for example, if someone has had a family member die that year, and it is around the holiday time, it's Christmas time, and you don't know, like, is this affecting their productivity? You assume that because their daughter died this year, that maybe there's some stuff that's going on that would make Christmas difficult, but you don't know. But you want to be supportive because you're trying to be this empathetic manager and coworker. Something that we would equip you to be able to practice and say is something like, I imagine that the holidays could be a really complicated time for you since Laura died. I'm so sorry for your loss. And that sort of a statement allows that person, if they're feeling like talking about it more, to say something like, yeah, it's just been really crappy. I hate putting up the tree without her, and I just feel sad all the time. And then you can have another follow-up statement. I imagine it would be really sad and hard. Again, like that sort of just, you're not telling your own story. You're not putting judgment about what they're saying. You're just kind of mirroring back to them. Or on the other hand, if you say, hey, I imagine the holidays could be really hard since Laura died. I'm so sorry. And the person says, thanks, and then, ducks their head and wants to go, you've still shown empathy and concern, but you've also realized, like, oh, that person doesn't want to talk about it right now for whatever reason. So that's that sort of like initial assessment that allows you to put out those bids and get that response. And then we teach you also like how to read that situation. If somebody wants to talk way too much, what are some basic things that you can say to be able to signal like, hey, I really appreciate you sharing. There are a couple of things that I have to finish up this morning, but I'd like to point you to resources, whether that's within the employee assistance program or let's talk again later. So it's kind of a decision tree that we run people through to be able to have these steps of assessment and then the next step that are helpful.
Mm-hmm. Well, that is certainly helpful. And you called it out there. But one thing I didn't hear you say was, I just know from firsthand experience, I know exactly what you're going through.
Right.
I know the pain to a T, because when you're on that other side, I can assume that the receiving that's even harder. It's like, no, you don't. You don't know what this is like. You don't know in this season.
Yeah, everybody's pain or grief is so singular to them. Sure. I mean, I found that in my own story of loss. Even with grief is the most isolating emotion. I have found, even walking with my husband in the death of a daughter, like you'd want to think, oh, you are the other parent to Mercy. Surely if anyone should understand what I'm going through right now, it would be you. Mm-hmm. And even the realization like, man, we were just, there's sometimes where we were in line, but so many times we were on completely different like planes of emotional existence. And it's because we were living out of our own experience. So to make or signal, I know what you're going through. You might know some aspect of it. And that could even be helpful like later on if you're someone who's having more conversations. But in those initial touch points, especially in a workplace setting where you don't know how deeply someone wants to go to, yeah, exactly. That shouldn't be your first go-to.
Yeah. And I think that that's been modeled pretty often, or, everything happens for a reason, or those really awful one-liners.
Right. I was just with, in the last month, a man who was talking about the death of his young son. And one of the most painful things that someone offered was, God has a plan for all of this, which reminds me of what I heard well-meaning people say after the death of my daughter. God just needed another angel for him. And it's a caution of saying, you never know how your words are going to be interpreted. And perhaps spirituality has been really helpful for you or a listener in their journey. I know it's deeply impactful, in my story. If I were to sit down and over the next hour tell you, like, I would tell about how it intersected with my doubt about God and my world of faith and, coming around and the answers that I have. But your answer is not going to be everyone's answer. And especially in workplace settings, because you really don't know where people are coming from. You want to be especially cautious with those sorts of statements.
That's a great point. So our audience is, an audience of young professionals in the first 10 years of careers. As we're listening today, either, some of us may be in the midst of these disruptive or multiple disruptive life events, or know someone, work along someone, even have a manager that's in the midst of a disruptive life event. When you're that young professional, you're the employee, you're not the manager leading these conversations for the team or for employees. Can you give us any helpful points, even just perspective on that? Because sometimes this can be an intimidating piece where it's like a lot of things we cover on Sharpen where it's like, I'm not the manager, I'm not the leader, I'm not the CEO. So where am I? Who am I to lead this conversation or to be a part of this?
I'm not the person in charge yet. Yep. Although, as young professionals, it's amazing how quickly you find yourself as the middle-aged professional. I'm getting closer to that point myself. I'm gonna answer that from two different approaches. One, you mentioned perhaps there's a young professional listening, and maybe they have no point of resonance at this, juncture. They would say, my health is good. Like, I don't have anything like that. It's not to have people live in fear, but I was that, wide-eyed. I'd gotten the scholarship from my MBA program. I had everything mapped out. And man, I was just caught completely off guard, and I felt like knocked off my feet. I can think of a conversation recently with a woman who got divorced in her 20s, and how staggering that was, of being like, what's even the category? People don't even have a category for this. They have middle-aged divorcees, and nobody knows how to deal with me or talk with me. Or a health scare with your parents. Like, it can be you. And when it happens really quickly. So just that sense of, if someone around you could be needing this really soon, and you yourself could as well. What it looks like to be on the side of giving care. I'm part of an organization. I want it to be empathetic. I want to be that person. I want to be managed that way. A couple of things. One, you can start just by living that reality in your interactions with other people. Are you asking these good, like, non-leading questions? Are you making yourself able to be available just to say, I'm sorry, like, this seems really hard, and to not move away from noting these difficult things, but to be able to be a person to say, hey, I want to build this in our workplace. The second is...
Can I interrupt you for a second? Can you give us an example of what you mean by a good non-leading question versus the opposite of that?
Sure. Okay. So someone who is in their 40s, you've heard through, like, The Office, scuttlebutt. They just moved out of their house. There's probably a divorce going on. Maybe you've met this person's husband once at, a Christmas party. And also you can see, like, man, she seems to be, like, going to the bathroom and crying a lot. Like, I've noticed that. I've seen it. What am I supposed to do? Like, we're on a team together and we have lunch together, but I don't really know, like, should I step into this? Should I just ignore it and, like, pretend that everything's cool? As you're wanting to be an empathetic person in that situation, you could say a leading question, or a question that is prying and probably inappropriate, would be like, oh my gosh, I can't believe that you left Jack. You seemed like such a great guy. What happened? Like, tell me what happened. That is jumping into the world of like the emotional, but it's just digging for information. It's pretty leading.
Yeah.
Or you could have a leading question that leads with your own experience. Something like, man, I have had a string of the worst boyfriends also. Like, I moved out of 3 different guys' apartments. I completely know how you feel. It has to be really hard, and he must be such a jerk. I've moved out of relationships with a number of different jerks as well. That's another example of like a leading question that's kind of prying, is kind of putting your situation out there. A better response to that older person to display empathy would just be say something like, I heard that there have been some changes that have happened at home. I imagine that this is a time of so much transition, and those transitions can be really hard. But I want to let you know that I believe in you and your capacity here at work, and I want to just keep walking with you through that as a friend and a coworker in whatever way that looks like. That's acknowledging, hey, times of transition are hard. It could affect your work. It also is throwing in there. So this is another part of like putting empathy in the workplace. A lot of times when people are going through something hard, they wonder if they can be good at their jobs. They are wondering like, can I brush my teeth each morning, let alone show up and be able to make a sales pitch in this big project coming up? Even Sheryl Sandberg, she wrote a book, Option B, recently about her husband dying on a treadmill all of a sudden. And she is like, she had written Lean In at this point. She speaks internationally. She's got this high flying job. And she talked about coming into work and really having meetings where she was like not focused and felt like she just said something that was totally off base, and this sense of like self-doubt. Can I even come back to work? And how important it was for her to have Mark Zuckerberg be able to come and say, I believe in you. You are good at your job, and this is hard right now, but you haven't just become bad at your job. You're going to be able to regain those capacities. I see that in you. I believe in you. And I think that is something that we crave in the midst of disruption. Do you still think that I can be that person who I was? And it's not saying like, hey, get it together. Like you've really fallen apart, but like, I still see you and I still believe in you. I think people want to hear that.
That's really helpful. That's really helpful. Well, I certainly, we were discussing as a young professional and being the carrier of creating that culture of empathy, and I didn't want to cut you off on, I just think it was important to walk through kind of practically those examples of leading questions versus non-leading. So
can I jump in there with one more
message?
Yes,
yeah,
I'm gonna jump in there. I think that it's something to be bringing up as a desire within your workplace, to be able to say, so you've listened to this podcast, to be able to ask the question, hey, what are we doing to build empathy in the workplace? It's in some ways even a diversity and inclusion question.
Sure.
A little bit, because when you have an event like this, it actually puts you outside the normal experience of the average worker in a way that feels isolating, in a way that you don't know how to integrate. And so to ask your HR director, like, hey, what sort of support systems do we have in place for something like this? I was hearing about a workplace recently that just that the employees had put together like an informal sort of a support group. I think it was specifically for people who had like a sickness or a diagnosis in the last year, but for any sort of wide-ranging thing. And they met like once a month at lunch. It wasn't facilitated by any manager or any aspect of the directors. It was just people getting together with the express purpose of like, hey, we're all going through something hard right now, and maybe there's something that we can offer. And just what that was doing to begin to shift culture. It is a work that I am trying to do and promote. So I would point people towards listening to the Handle with Care podcast, which has just launched. We share stories of people who have gone through these disruptive life events, whether that is adopting a child from overseas, or going through miscarriages, or experiencing a spouse's diagnosis. It's really story based, but we end each episode with these really actionable tips that help you as you want to become a better coworker, manager, or friend. So I hope that that is something that people are listening to and using, maybe even using within their team meetings to say, hey, let's listen to this together and let's talk about what sort of support systems do we have for somebody who's going through X, Y, or Z. So I hope it is something that management is recognizing and at the C-suite level is wanting to build in. But I think there's also definitely a place for the young professionals within the organization to say, hey, this is something that we would want or hope for. And this is, in fact, something that we can build informally and begin like putting the conversation out there of like, are we doing this well or not?
Yeah, well, and I'm sure that you probably have the data, but the data is there around not only employee engagement but employee loyalty, retention. I am certain that someone far smarter than myself has gathered the data around the ROI, and not that that's only what it's about for an employee or for a company, right? But to be able to say, hey, here are the numbers around when you're willing to engage in this piece. Like it's not only good for your bottom line, it's good for your culture, and it's an important piece of what we want as young professionals. I mean, that's a pretty legit conversation to have with a manager, with your team, with your company's leadership.
It is. It's a great conversation to have. One data point that is interesting is, it's been almost more than 15 years now, but the Grief Recovery Institute launched a study that was trying to put numbers to, okay, what is the cost of grief in the workplace? And grief, they weren't just talking about a death. They were talking all the way to a death of a pet, relocating, just these hard things that happen. And what they found within their data set was at the time that there was a $75 billion loss to American companies each year. And things that were factored into that loss were a little bit of what we mentioned earlier, this presenteeism, employees who are there, but they're mentally checked out. So they're really not executing on how you want them to be engaged with their tasks because they just can't. All the way to people who feel so mishandled that they quit. I talked with a woman within the last couple of months who her coworkers had reported her to her manager of saying, we're just uncomfortable with her having to go cry in the bathroom. She was going to cry in the bathroom. And these women said, just hearing her cry in the bathroom is too much. We're feeling overwhelmed. And how that whole conversation went and the whole process of it, she said, I can't work here anymore. Like, I'm just done. And she had the cost of having to recruit and retrain and all those sorts of costs are figured into that $75 billion number. You adjust that for 2019 dollars, that's more than $100 billion of loss to American companies. And sometimes a number that is that big, it feels like, whoa, that's a big number, but how do I translate that to my specific firm? A great way to illustrate this is just to play out a story of someone who is within the firm. Okay, so if Jack in IT has something really sad happen with his sister-in-law, that means that he has to be picking up all of this slack within her family because she has died unexpectedly, and he's having to travel to help out with his brother, and he's having to do all of this stuff. And let's say his manager does a really poor job of supporting him and makes him feel like he's dropping the ball all the time, and they never have that conversation about what the expectation is or what it isn't. And 6 weeks later, Jack, who is one of our top performers and he did such a great job, he just feels like he's had it up to here, and he has a huge blow up in the office, yells at his supervisor, and then he's facing termination of this whole proceeding. What is the actual cost to Jack, who's been a great employee and he's done such a good job? And did it really have to end that way? And what's the actual dollar amount to having to retrain and his lost productivity? And if we could have intervened instead, 6 weeks ago and put in some safeguards did it really have to go that way? Or could Jack, like you said, on the other side, when people are like met in this, when they feel like their place of employment has provided them with a safe space, in the software-based tool that we're building out, we're putting in like, okay, you can have access to 6 to 8 meal deliveries. It can be with Panera or your favorite place, and the company just pays for that. And you have, 2 visits from a house cleaner over the next quarter. And you've had this touch point where somebody has really expressed care in a meaningful way. When people receive that sort of a thing, I mean, they're like your advocates for life. Like,
Heck
this is the
yeah.
best place to work. I love them. I'd recommend them to anybody. So those sorts of exercises really put like the human experience to some of those numbers, which are real.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I think the first time we connected, I'd shared with you, just speaking from own personal experience. I was sharing I had this fantastic manager, and having 2 children and that experience transitioning back, we were just kind of talking through with the birth of a little baby, and I think I told you, I was like, I'm all in, like I am on that team. I am the raving fan, the president of the fan club, and people make companies.
They
And I
do.
think that as managers, as employees, we have to, and not just the manager, people make employees. And when we forget that piece, then we're really losing sight of what it means to have employee engagement, satisfaction, loyalty. And that's a really helpful piece there that you share when you can hear a big number. And okay, so how can we break this down to something actually quite realistic that could happen in our own company? Tell us, you had mentioned your podcast and you had mentioned some of the episodes. We are so excited at Sharpen. This is an amazing resource. Drive these conversations in your companies, with your teams, with your employees. So tell us a little bit more about Handle with Care, where we can find you, and anything else that we need to know.
Yes, thank you for asking. Podcaster to podcaster,
Yeah.
we are really excited to be launching the Handle with Care podcast. And again, it's wanting to get at how we build empathy in the workplace, but doing it through stories. Because so many times in the workplace, you get like such a narrow sliver of somebody's life experience. You don't know what's going on behind the scenes because it isn't really the place for it. It's not necessarily your place to ask. But what does it look like to give people a glimpse of what is really going on in the midst of this disruption? And while one story is not every story, I believe that there are some great things for listeners to connect with, to go, oh my gosh, so you really have to think about your wife throwing up in the car on the way back from her chemo treatments multiple times a day, and how inconvenient that is to be able to schedule rides in the midst of your workday. I never even thought that would be a thing, but I wonder for so-and-so whose spouse is going through something similar, what are some support systems that we could offer them? So it offers those sort of experience-based learnings. And we've got great guests that are sharing just out of really vulnerable places. And again, I mentioned we're interviewing people who have gone through divorce, who've gone through their own diagnosis, dealing with chronic illness, dealing with issues around the childbearing years, dealing with the loss of a child and surviving after that. So we're covering some really relevant topics. We end each episode with some actionable tips, key takeaways. And while it focuses on what happens in the workplace, what we say is these are tips that help make you a better manager, a better coworker, and just a better friend. We can be found at Apple Podcasts under Handle with Care, Empathy at Work. We are also on Google Play and Stitcher and TuneIn. The podcast page is linked to my website, which is lieselmertes.com. We're on LinkedIn promoting, and we're doing some especially fun giveaways. I know that this will launch a little bit afterwards, but if the giveaways keep going well, we'll keep giving stuff away because it's a great way to have people be engaged. So I hope it's wonderful for listening on your commute or listening within teams and prompting conversations. And I credit just some really brave, generous guests who share out of their own stories.
Well, thank you for pursuing this podcast, and not just the podcast, but the work that you do. I'm just so encouraged here today with this time with you, and what you are really focused in on. We talked about this is an important piece of conversation for workplace, for our Sharpen audience. I think this is very much the heartbeat of what we want to be about in the workplace. So thank you. We will be listing all show notes, or all the links in our show notes today of everything you mentioned. So for those of you that are listening right now, be sure to scroll down, find the links to wherever you listen to your podcast for Handle with Care, and be sure to subscribe. And I think there's some really cool giveaways, one involving pie. And as a Kentuckian, you say the word pie, and maybe that one will be irrelevant the time that this episode comes live. But y'all, if there's one for pie, you got to know the Kentuckians are going to be all about it. So you'll have your
And this pie, they ship all across the U.S. This place was featured on Oprah. It's so good. I went to the shop even just to like meet the owner, and I couldn't walk out the door without getting a huge pie, of which my husband ate 3.5 pieces after breakfast. It was so good. So it's great.
Yes, I love it. I love it. Well, we have so enjoyed this time with you today, Liesel. Your work. And thank you for sharing your story with us. We'd love to hear from you. Of course, first of all, we want to use you to do us a favor, and we'd love to hear a shout out of to someone or a group of people that you want to express gratitude to.
Yeah, I was thinking about that. There are so many, but I'm going to give a shout out today to all of the people who actually came and spent the night in the hospital with Moses, who's my youngest, through all of his open heart surgeries. I think when I consider meaningful gestures of care, Luke and I were spending these incredibly long days in the hospital, and we really needed to go home and sleep. And there was this group of people who just they were still going to the office the next day, all these things. And we said, we really don't want Moses to be alone at night. And they came and spent the night in uncomfortable hospital beds, drinking like the baby apple juice that they give you, and just being up with Moses through the night so he knew he wasn't alone. That group of people, it just almost always makes me cry to think it wasn't even something I fully knew I needed until somebody offered. And it was like one of the best gifts for my mother's heart. So you know who you are, and I love each of you.
That's so good. And there's another thing, a bit of wisdom I hear. You sometimes don't know what you need until it's offered. That sounds like a really important piece of this conversation today too. So thanks for mentioning that.
Yeah.
We'd also love to hear from you today, a game changer. So it's something that I think I told you before we got started. It can be anything under the sun, of something that has been a game changer moment. And I shared this with David Fox in our Enneagram episode. If you've ever seen The Office, it kind of ruined game changer moments, because Mr. California there is he's like a game changer, a changer of the game, like very corny, making fun of it. And I was like, no, I have to take that out of the podcast now, but I'm not. It's still valid. And this is a very resourceful piece of what we do on Sharpen. So I'm keeping it, and I would love to hear your game changer.
The game changer that I thought of specifically as I was thinking about what I was going to talk about today came my second year of business school. So I'd had Mercy die, but I'm still like in business school, going through it all and facing that self-doubt of like, oh my gosh, am I going to be able to like keep up at all of these fellow students? Like they're young, they've got no kids, they're doing these great trips. And I was like, I'm just sad all the time. And I'm the parent of these 2 kids, and I'm just trying to do my homework. And oh my gosh. And we went on a business school consulting engagement out to California. And we had this case competition where we had to pitch our solution to this car company. And I was part of my team, and I was actually the person who got to do the big pitch. But like we'd all work together as a team, but I was the public presenting face. And it went really well, and we won. And that sense of being able to like look at myself in that moment and still being all of those things. Like I was still sad, I was still all of those things. But the support of that team community and my professors, and that moment to almost be external to myself and be like, oh, but there's still another part of me that is existing in tandem with this very sad part. And I haven't like lost that person. She's still there, but I need to find a way to keep connecting and finding her within that. So that was a game changer feeling, kind of a moment that comes to mind.
Oh, that is so cool. That's so cool.
Yeah.
Very affirming in all of your many gifts and talents. And for those, we are so thankful too. We wish you all the best in all of the work that you're doing. And of course, we'll say it one more time. Be sure to check out Handle with Care on all of the podcast avenues that Liesel mentioned. Thank you for joining us today. This has been such a good time with you.
Thank you, Kirby.